When I left you at the end of episode 1, we'd only done one step of my 5 steps into Shakespeare. We'd looked at key moments in Henry V when the king had to persuade his listeners to do something he needed them to do. We considered who was speaking and who was listening in order to figure out the kind of rhetoric that they would use to say what they needed to say. Now let's go on and consider where we can go for help to understand what it is our characters are saying, and to begin to put some names to some of those rhetorical tricks that King Henry is so fond of. Step 2 is where some of you will be thinking I'm stating the obvious, but I have the feeling that teachers a lot of the time just assume everyone knows about how notes work and don't actually take the trouble to go through what's in them. So let's look at the notes closely and pick out what you really need. But before you can worry about how to use the notes, you have to have an edition that has some. Any of the many versions that you see on the screen here have excellent notes that are going to help you guide your way into the play, and don't try and do without them, because as we're about to look at in detail, the notes are what are going to be your way in, your entry point. There are some excellent online editions available that will give you a basic text for free but ask you to pay a bit in order to get the notes. It's definitely worth it, or it's worth buying a good book like one of these, because these are the places you will go to get the information you need to find your way in. Having said that, there is a technique to addressing the notes and making them work for you. Because what are you even meant to do when you're faced with a page like this that is completely full and only this much is the actual script of lines people are saying to each other, and everything else on the page is notes? So let's look at the things that you will typically find down there below so you can pick out the ones that are helpful for you right now. First of all, you're going to see references to sources, and that means where Shakespeare was getting his information, his references, and very often his plots. In this case, the historian Holinshead, but he did pick up and use material from an incredibly wide variety of places, and that's what you're going to see described here. Secondly, you're going to see a bunch of Q's and F's, and those refer to different ways that the plays originally could be printed, and therefore sometimes different versions of the same play we have, but unless you're interested in very technical things, you can safely ignore those for now. The next type of note falls into the maybe not strictly necessarily, but certainly very interesting category, which is all kinds of historic context, things that tell you about how the plays were originally performed or what was going on at the time in the world that influenced what you read in the plays. So that's really up to you whether you're finding it interesting or not, whether you pay attention to this bit. And buried in all that is this one thing that is absolutely vital, and you do want to go down into the notes and dig it out and look at it, because there's some bits that tell you about the meanings of words, and meanings change, and some of the words are archaic and some of them look the same but they mean something different these days, and that is really going to help you. So always start by scanning the notes to see if there's anything in there that actually gives you a meaning, because that is what's going to help you going from looking at a great big block of a speech like this and just seeing a wall of words to traveling through the speech with the speaker and realizing how full and rich those words are making the journey. It's the notes that are going to explain to you that practiced in this period, in this context, means worked on. That bolted was a term from sifting flour, so what it means, finely bolted, means it looks as if all the impurities have been removed. It looks as if the man he's looking at is like the best, finest, most expensive, pure flour. It's the notes that will tell you that tempered has connotations both of moulding something with wax and also, of course, of forging weapons. So this is how we know that the choice of that word reflects on his idea of this man as someone who has been forged into purity. Or even the many times that biblical and classical references turn up, it's the notes that are going to tell you what's being referred to, so you feel like you're part of it and not like you're being left out. Now, once you get interested not just in the meanings and the references, the basics, but in the art of it, in the rhetorical strategies, then you need to look a little bit further. I put a link there for one of my favourite websites that will help you understand the full book that artists like Shakespeare were drawing on in this period. But as I described in the first video, Shakespeare belonged to a literary society that just loved to see what people could do with rhetoric. So if you want to make the leap from merely understanding the words and the references to really getting a feel for what Shakespeare thought he needed to do to reach his audience, you need to start talking about rhetorical strategies and devices. Let's look in a little more detail at some of the rhetorical strategies that Henry pulls out in his most famous of all his speeches, the St. Crispin's Day speech, the speech where he has to drag his demoralised, depleted troops into battle and not just convince them that they can win, but that they can have the kind of victory that will echo throughout history forever. And he has two broad strategies that he uses to do this. He begins with a series of challenges, and then he moves into a series of aspirational visions, offerings of hope for a future that would seem appealing to these men at this time. So to begin with, he starts with, if we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss, and if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honour. So right away we've got a couple of things going on there. There's that antithesis that Shakespeare loves so much between the juxtaposition of life and death, but there's also the introduction of the word honour, and you'll be astonished how many times that comes up in this speech. So he says, hey, if you don't want to be here, we're fine with that, off you go. We don't want to die with someone who doesn't want to die with us. And it's laying down a challenge to each individual man to think, am I going to be the kind of person who will leave in this situation, or do I want to be someone who stands with the king on this? And then he moves into the second half of the speech where he imagines a future where they survive and are safe, and this becomes their most glorious and treasured memory. He that shall see this day and live old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbours and say, tomorrow is St. Crispian. Then shall he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day. And the vision he's creating there is of safety, it's of home, it's of family and comradeship, it's of flowing cups and feasts and times of plenty. And so what he's done is a two-pronged attack where his men would hesitate to leave or back out because of the challenge that has been thrown down, but also where they will be drawn in to the idea that this horrifying event, this terrible day, will one day be their most cherished memory. Smart guy. Shakespeare, of course, was writing Henry this way to do a particular kind of storytelling. He was talking about a time almost 200 years before, so a little bit like the gap between now and the Napoleonic Wars, talking about a time when England had won a war, when it had really spent a lot of time before and since losing. So while he was doing history, he was really more focused on the story part, telling the story that his audience wanted to hear, at the same time as providing them with the ideas surrounding current philosophy that Elizabethans loved to see animated on stage, and giving his actor a personality platform. But we're very early in the process here. Stick with me and I'll give you all 5 of these steps to work with. So far we've only looked at 2, and in the final Henry V video we'll go on to this third. And in the meantime, I'll leave you to contemplate the fact that the average Englishman in Shakespeare's day and Henry's could draw a 90-pound longbow. I think it really doesn't hurt for us to stop and think about just how much your average Englishman at this time could kill you. See you in episode 3.